Who would have thought that a wild bobcat would kneel in the mud and ask a heartbroken ranger for help? Evan Turner had lost all hope that morning. A hurt mother bobcat broke every rule of the wild and put everything on the line to try to save her trapped kitten. What happened next made everyone in the town get up and change the meaning of trust forever. If you believe some miracles are born from the unlikeliest partnerships, subscribe to my channel for more true stories that blur the line between wild and human. The old Ford Ranger crept down the forest road, tires slogging through muddy patches left over from last night's rain. Dawn was just breaking, pale gold and smoky purple stretching over the tops of the pines. Evan Turner, bundled up in his ranger coat, watched the world slowly come alive through the windshield, his fingers drumming the steering wheel in time with some half-remembered tune from when he was a kid. Most mornings, this drive was like a quiet ritual. The same winding road, the same peaceful hush, broken only by the call of a chickadee or the sharp crack of a branch under a deer's hoof. Out here, miles away from Alder Pines, Montana, Evan could almost forget the ache in his chest, the echo in his house since Claire left, the missing sound of his father's voice on the radio. The wild didn't pity him, and in its own way, that was comforting. But today felt different. It started with a blur, a flash of movement as something tawny shot out from the trees and onto the road. Evan slammed the brakes, heart pounding as the truck shuddered to a stop, the engine growling its complaint. For a second, he thought he'd hit something, but then he saw her, a bobcat, lean, wild, and clearly desperate. She limped out of the trees, her coat patchy and soaked, one back leg dragging behind her. Before Evan could do a thing, before he could even catch his breath, she did something that made the world stand still. She knelt. Right there in the middle of the muddy road, the bobcat lowered herself, shoulders hunched, head down, but her eyes locked onto Evan's. It wasn't the wary, keep-your-distance look wild animals usually give. There was a plea in her gaze, raw and vulnerable, almost human shining out from those yellow-green eyes. Evan held his breath, afraid to even move. For a long, quiet moment, neither of them budged. It felt like the whole forest paused with them, every bird and squirrel holding their breath. Evan saw her ribs fluttering with fast, shallow breaths, watched her ears flick nervously. She was terrified, but something was keeping her there. Mud clung to her whiskers, her breath fogged in the cold morning air. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice muffled by the window. It felt silly, talking to a wild bobcat. But words were all he had. He killed the engine, not wanting the sound to scare her off or send her collapsing. Injured animals never came to people for help, and certainly not to a truck. But she stayed, held there by something even stronger than fear. Evan scanned the roadside, looking for traps, other animals, anything that might explain why she'd come. The woods were thick with brambles and pine needles, the dawn light soft and new. Then he spotted it, a trail of muddy paw prints leading from the brush to the spot where she knelt. And beyond that, just barely, he heard it. A thin, desperate mewling, the faintest cry drifting over the quiet morning air, the sound of a kitten calling for help. His pulse spiked. The bobcat's eyes flickered, following his gaze toward the source of the sound. She made a low, guttural noise, a plea, a command, an apology. Evan understood somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with language. She wasn't just asking for help. She was begging. He grabbed his radio. Static crackled, but he hesitated before calling for backup. This was a moment on the knife's edge. One wrong move, and the fragile trust between man and wild would snap. He pushed open the truck door, boots sinking into the cold, red mud. The air tasted of pine sap and earth. He stepped out slowly, hands visible, heartbeat drumming loud in his ears. The bobcat didn't run. She didn't flinch. She just watched, eyes wide, tail twitching, every muscle tight with hope and dread. Evan dropped to one knee, matching her posture. They stared at each other, two beings lost and hurting in their own ways, caught in a silent bargain. Somewhere in the pines, the kitten wailed again, a sound full of fear and fading strength. Evan made a decision. He nodded just once. "Okay," he said softly. "I'm here. Let's get your baby." The bobcat's ears perked, her gaze flickering with new intensity. Evan took a careful breath, wiped his palms on his jeans, and started toward the underbrush, following her pleading eyes. He didn't know what he would find, or whether help would come in time. All he knew was that in that moment, on a muddy forest road, at the break of day, a wild mother's trust became the most urgent, important thing in his world. And for the first time in a long time, Evan Turner felt a purpose burning in his chest, fierce and clear as the sunrise over alder pines. Evan moved cautiously through the thicket, each step sinking into the saturated red mud, his boots leaving deep impressions that filled with cold water. The bobcat, Juniper, he found himself thinking of her that way, followed at a wary distance, limping heavily, but never taking her gaze off Evan or the shadowy undergrowth beyond. Overhead, the first rays of sun filtered through the tall pines, catching in the lingering mist and painting everything with a silvery hue. Every nerve in Evan's body felt stretched thin, tuned to the smallest sound. He strained to hear that kitten's cry again, the desperate mewling that had pierced the morning quiet. But now the only sounds were the wet squelch of his boots and the uncertain rustle of Juniper's movements behind him. Was the kitten still alive? Or was Evan already too late? As he pressed forward, his mind flickered backward, unbidden, as memories often do. He remembered a different morning, years ago, walking this same stretch of forest road with his father, the legendary Bill Turner. Bill had been the heart of alder pines, the ranger everyone trusted, the man who could coax a bear cub down from a tree or patch up a wounded coyote with nothing but an old towel and a steady voice. Everyone admired Bill, and growing up in his shadow had felt both a blessing and a burden. Evan had idolized his father's quiet strength, the way he seemed to know what every creature needed, even when those creatures were his own family. But after Bill passed, suddenly, heartbreakingly, Evan found the silence left behind almost unbearable. It was as if the forest itself mourned, each dawn colder and more hollow than the last. Then there was Claire, who had once promised forever, and ended up leaving Evan with nothing but a box of old photos and the echo of arguments that never found a resolution. She couldn't take the isolation, she'd said, the endless space and the way Evan retreated into himself after his father's death. He couldn't blame her. Most days, he didn't even recognize the man he'd become. Still, Evan had always felt a strange kinship with the wild things, the solitary fox slipping through the brush at dusk, the hawk perched alone against the sunrise. Their solitude seemed like a badge of honor, a sign of resilience. Lately, though, that solitude felt less like strength and more like a wound that wouldn't heal. That's why this moment, with Juniper at his back and a vulnerable life somewhere ahead, pressed against his chest like a prayer. It demanded that he step out of his own pain, even for just a morning, and become someone worthy of trust again. A sudden movement to his right snapped Evan out of his reverie. He paused, heart pounding, and scanned the tangled brambles. There, a smear of muddy fur, the tiniest flick of a striped tail. The kitten, Maple, was trapped in a shallow depression at the edge of a half-collapsed burrow. The mud around her was slick, sucking, pockmarked with roots and stones. She tried to scramble up, claws scrabbling against the slippery bank. But each time she slid back, more exhausted and scared. Evan's breath caught. The urge to rush in, to scoop her up and end this ordeal, was overwhelming. But he knew enough to check his impulse. Any sudden movement could spook Juniper, or worse, cause the kitten to panic and hurt herself further. He crouched low, keeping his voice gentle and steady. "Hey there, little one," he murmured, as much for his own nerves as for the frightened creature. "You picked a rough spot, didn't you?" Juniper whined behind him, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through Evan's thoughts. She took a hesitant step closer, her body taut with hope and fear. Evan felt the weight of her expectation, the silent plea that connected them more powerfully than words ever could. He reached for his radio, thumb trembling as he pressed the button. "This is Ranger Turner. I need assistance on Old Pine Road, about a mile past the trailhead. Injured wildlife. Possible rescue needed. Bring ropes, planks, anything for a mud extraction. Over." The static hissed, then a familiar voice crackled through. "Copy that, Evan. I'm en route. We'll call in Sheriff Brooks and a few folks from the wildlife group. Hang tight." Relief warred with anxiety in Evan's chest. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. Maybe he never truly had been. While he waited for help, he studied the mud pit, trying to map out the safest route. The ground looked deceptively solid at the edge, but he could see where the kitten's small body had sunk in deeper, the mud almost up to her belly now. One false step and she could vanish beneath the surface, or he could. Evan fished a battered leather glove from his pocket and, moving with agonizing slowness, edged closer to the pit. Maple's eyes were wide, gold and frantic, her fur caked with mud and her whiskers trembling. She mewled again, a raw, hoarse sound that nearly broke Evan's resolve. Behind him, Juniper circled, her limp worsening with every pass. At one point, she let out a low yowl, then glanced toward the sound of distant engines. Sirens? Or just the volunteers he'd called for? The hope in her eyes made Evan's chest ache. The sun was higher now, warming the mist, making every shadow sharper. Soon, he knew, there'd be more hands to help, more voices breaking the isolation that had defined both his and Juniper's worlds for far too long. For now, it was just him, a wild mother, and the fragile life they both needed to save. Evan reached out, his gloved hand steady, his heart thrumming with fear and hope. "Hold on, Maple," he whispered. "Help's on the way. You're not alone." And for the first time in months, neither was he. Evan's knees pressed into the sodden earth as he surveyed the scene, searching for any angle, any path that would bring him closer to the shivering bundle in the mud without risking everything. The forest, usually a place of tranquil routine, now felt fraught with urgency. Morning birdsong faded into the background, replaced by the frantic beat of Evan's heart and the desperate whimpers of the trapped kitten. The red mud was thicker than he'd expected, slick, with a strange, oily sheen where water had pooled. Pine roots spiderwebbed beneath the surface, sometimes vanishing beneath brambles or re-emerging as twisted, gnarled claws. Every step was a gamble. The ground might hold, or it might give way and suck him in. He spoke softly, more for himself than the kitten. "We're gonna get you out, Maple, just hold on." Juniper, the mother bobcat, watched from a few yards away, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Evan kept her in his peripheral vision, aware of how close the edge of wildness was, how easily panic or pain could turn this delicate moment into disaster. But she stayed, pacing anxiously, never taking her eyes from Maple. Evan inched forward, his hands open and slow, Maple's little face, streaked with mud, turned toward him, eyes wide with terror and hope. She tried to lift herself again, tiny claws scraping at the slick earth, but her legs slipped and she slid back with a weak, exhausted cry. The sight sent a bolt of helpless anger through Evan, anger at fate, at the cruel luck that stranded innocent creatures in harm's way. Just then, a car horn blared in the distance. Evan's radio crackled, and he could hear voices. A faint, muddled sound that promised help was near. He straightened, waved one arm, and saw a pickup truck crawling up the rutted forest road. Sheriff Diane Brooks was at the wheel, her short gray hair and no-nonsense eyes unmistakable even from here. Behind her, a battered Suburban rumbled. 2 volunteers from the wildlife group crammed in the back with ropes, wooden planks, and a bundle of thick wool blankets. Sheriff Brooks jumped out before the engine stopped. "Where's the action, Turner?" He gestured toward the pit. "Maple's stuck in there. The mud's worse than it looks. She's sinking." Brooks surveyed the scene, her jaw tightening. "We'll need to be careful. Any sudden moves might spook both cats." The volunteers, an elderly man named Paul, his flannel shirt flecked with sawdust, and a younger woman, Tessa, who worked weekends at the animal shelter, unloaded their gear. Tessa eyed the bobcat, her voice low. "She's not running?" "No. She wants our help. I've never seen anything like it," Evan said, amazed by his own words. Paul started laying down planks, testing the ground's give with each step. "This mud'll suck the boots right off your feet if you're not careful. Let's make a bridge." Evan helped, easing a heavy board down across the least treacherous patch, then wedging another against the rim of the pit. Tessa unwound a length of rope, tying a loop and tossing the end toward the middle, just close enough for Evan to grab if he lost his footing. Sheriff Brooks knelt beside Evan, her gaze flicking between Maple and Juniper. "Give me a minute," she said, voice calm but urgent. "Let's get a blanket ready. That kitten's going to be freezing if we pull her out." Evan nodded, his hands trembling slightly as adrenaline faded into anxious focus. He crouched at the edge of the mud pit, heart hammering, and called softly to Maple. The kitten mewled, reached out a paw, and for a split second, it looked like she might be able to climb toward him. But the mud gripped her legs like concrete, pulling her back. Juniper whined, her tail twitching in agitation. Then, astonishingly, she edged closer and gently nudged the rope with her paw, shoving it nearer to Evan. The gesture, a wild animal helping the rescue, sent a ripple of awe through the group. "She's asking us to hurry," Tessa whispered. Evan slid the board a few more inches, mud sloshing dangerously over the edge. He lay flat, stretching his arms as far as they'd go, his fingertips just brushing Maple's trembling fur. The kitten squirmed, fighting the mud, but each movement sent her sinking deeper. "Don't rush her," Paul warned, steadying the rope. Evan locked eyes with Maple, willing her to trust him. He spoke in a low, steady voice, the same voice he'd used with panicked animals and, once upon a time, scared children on nature walks. "It's okay, Maple, I've got you." He slid his arm further, mud seeping under his cuff, cold and clammy. Maple let out a tiny hiss, Fear or pain, Evan couldn't tell, but she didn't lash out. With a final desperate reach, Evan's gloved hand wrapped gently around the kitten's scruff. He pulled, slow and steady, the way his father had taught him, feeling the suction of the mud give way with a sticky pop. Suddenly Maple broke free, her whole body limp and shaking in his grasp. Evan cradled her against his chest, wrapping her in the waiting blanket. Tessa stepped in, gently wiping mud from Maple's face, checking for injuries. Paul and Sheriff Brooks cheered quietly, careful not to startle Juniper. But just as relief swept through the group, the ground beneath Evan's knees shifted. A warning groan as the edge of the pit threatened to collapse. He scrambled backward, clutching Maple tight, his boots skidding over the slick boards. Paul hauled him up by the rope, and Evan staggered clear of the danger, legs trembling with exhaustion. Juniper let out a sharp yowl, rushing forward with surprising speed despite her limp. She nuzzled Maple, licking her fur, whining and purring all at once. The emotion in her wild eyes, relief, gratitude, love, hit Evan like a tidal wave. For a brief, shining moment, the divide between human and animal vanished. They were simply parents, both desperate to save what mattered most. Sheriff Brooks snapped a photo, hands trembling. "No one's ever going to believe this," she said, voice thick with emotion. The rescue wasn't over. Maple needed warmth, shelter, and maybe a vet's care. But for now, under the rising Montana sun, Evan felt a hope he hadn't known in years. He watched Juniper and Maple, mother and child, reunited, and knew this story, this connection, was only just beginning. Maple's tiny body trembled as Evan wrapped her in the thick wool blanket, trying to shield her from the chill of the mountain morning. Her fur, once the color of autumn leaves, was slicked flat with mud, her eyes wide and glazed with exhaustion. She mewled softly, the sound weak but alive, a small note of hope in the hush that had fallen over the group. Juniper hovered near, torn between her primal fear of humans and her desperate need to comfort her kitten. Evan crouched on the edge of the mud pit, boots caked and knees stained, barely noticing the cold biting through his wet jeans. All his focus was on Maple, his hands working gently but with purpose. Tessa and Paul moved in close, Tessa digging a thermos from her bag and pouring warm water into a spare dish for the kitten. Paul stood watch, his weathered face set in a grim line as he scanned the shadows for any sign of other dangers. Sheriff Brooks stepped back and lifted her radio, her voice clear but urgent. "Dispatch, this is Brooks. We have the kitten safe but need a mobile vet. Also requesting additional volunteers for extraction and possible wildlife containment. Over." The response was immediate. "Copy, Brooks. Vet on the way. Sending backup." Evan met the sheriff's eyes with a weary smile. "I think she'll make it, but we're not out of the woods yet, literally." Brooks nodded. "We'll get her seen by Dr. Lively. You just keep that kitten breathing, Turner." The tension didn't fully ease. Every second, Evan expected Juniper to bolt or to lash out in a panic, but she hovered at the very edge of human reach, her anxious gaze fixed on Maple. At one point, she even crept closer, close enough for Evan to feel the warmth of her breath on his hand. He froze, heart pounding, as Juniper gave a soft, plaintive yowl and extended one trembling paw, almost as if asking for reassurance. He spoke to her softly, never breaking eye contact. "She's okay, Juniper. I promise we'll help her." For a moment, Evan felt the rest of the world drop away. The aches in his heart, the muddy ground beneath him, the anxious radio chatter. It was just him and this wild mother, united in their fierce, silent love for a small, fragile life. Tessa worked quickly to clean Maple's face, careful to avoid the small cuts and scrapes that crisscrossed her nose and paws. "She's got some bruises and she's cold, but I think she's tough," Tessa murmured. "Do you think Juniper will let us keep helping?" Evan glanced at Juniper, who sat now with her body pressed low, tail curled around her injured leg. "I think she knows we're trying, but we'll need to move slow." A siren wailed in the distance, cutting through the quiet forest. Within minutes, another car pulled up. The local vet, Dr. Lively, a wiry woman with quick hands and a steady gaze. She came prepared, her bag brimming with supplies, her face set in a mask of calm authority. Dr. Lively knelt beside Evan, taking in the scene with a single, searching look. "Let's see what we've got," she said, rolling up her sleeves. She checked Maple's pulse and temperature, her movements gentle but efficient. Juniper tensed, but didn't move, her trust hanging by a thread. "She's hypothermic, exhausted, but nothing's broken," Dr. Lively said after a few tense minutes. "Get her warm and hydrated, and she should pull through. We'll have to be careful. She needs her mother." Paul and Tessa set up a makeshift shelter out of a tarp and some branches, creating a small, wind-blocked nook where Maple could rest. Tessa fetched another blanket, while Paul dug out a heat pack and tucked it beneath the blanket with the kitten. All the while, Juniper watched, shifting her weight nervously, occasionally uttering a low, worried moan. Evan leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. He felt a sense of pride and awe as the community fell into a rhythm, each person doing what they could, no matter how small, to give Maple a fighting chance. Sheriff Brooks took charge, assigning tasks and making sure the scene stayed calm. "Let's keep the noise down," she ordered. "Don't crowd the mother. We're guests in her home." A pair of high schoolers from the Wildlife Club arrived, bringing more blankets and a folding table. They eyed Juniper with wide-eyed wonder, whispering about how brave she was. One of them snapped a few photos, careful not to use the flash. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual background hum of life replaced by a hush of anticipation. Even the birds perched silently in the pines, as if they too were watching the drama unfold. As the hours passed, the tension slowly ebbed, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. Maple's breathing steadied, her eyes closed, and she nestled deeper into the warmth. Juniper moved closer, pressing her muzzle to the edge of the blanket, licking her kitten's ears with quick, nervous strokes. Evan, exhausted but relieved, finally sat back, letting the adrenaline drain from his limbs. Yet every so often, the calm would shatter, a branch snapping in the distance, a gust of wind shaking the tarp, or a new arrival stepping too close. Each time Juniper would stiffen, her muscles bunching as if she might flee, but each time she stayed. The trust she'd placed in Evan, in all of them, seemed to grow with every gentle touch and soft word. As afternoon light slanted through the trees, Evan looked around at the gathered crowd. Sheriff, volunteers, students, the vet, all united by the urgent hope of saving one small life. He realized suddenly that the ache of his own losses felt a little lighter. In giving Maple a chance, he'd found a sense of purpose, a reason to open his heart to the wild world again. Juniper, wild and wounded, met his gaze one last time before curling around her kitten, her eyes shining with something almost like gratitude. And as the first shadows lengthened on the muddy road, Evan knew that, for this one day at least, the line between wild and human had blurred in the most beautiful way. Evan barely had time to catch his breath before Sheriff Brooks gathered everyone for a quick huddle beside the mud pit. The air was thick with tension and the scent of pine, sweat, and wet earth. The makeshift rescue site felt both chaotic and sacred, a crossroads where wild and human worlds collided. "Okay, listen up," Brooke said, her tone brisk but warm. "We need to stabilize the ground and get everyone working together if we want to keep both cats safe. Paul, help me rig another plank bridge. Tessa, prep more rope and watch Maple. Evan, you and Dr. Lively focus on the mother. Nobody moves fast unless you want to spend the day digging yourself out." People nodded, falling into a rhythm shaped by necessity and adrenaline. Paul and the high schoolers worked quickly, setting planks end to end across the softest patches, testing each step with nervous laughter and shouted warnings. Evan joined Dr. Lively, both moving with the slow, deliberate motions of people who knew the forest could turn treacherous at any moment. Juniper paced at the edge of the action, her injured leg trembling. At times, her wild instincts nearly overwhelmed her. She would snarl softly, back away, or flatten her ears when a stranger came too close. But each time she saw Maple, her fragile kitten swaddled in warmth, being gently cared for, she forced herself to stay. Evan could see it in her golden eyes, a primal war between trust and terror, a love fierce enough to override fear. "Let's try to move her closer," Dr. Lively whispered, meaning Juniper. "She won't be calm until she can touch her kitten." Evan crouched, holding out his hand, palm up, the way his father had taught him to approach wounded animals. "It's okay, Juniper," he murmured, his voice a gentle echo in the trees. "She's safe. Come see for yourself." Juniper hesitated, eyes darting from Evan's hand to the small bundle at Tessa's feet. Her muscles bunched. Then, inch by inch, she crept forward, each step a testament to her fragile courage. When she reached Maple, the mother bobcat nuzzled her kitten, licking the mud from her fur with desperate, shaking strokes. Maple stirred, weak but alive, pressing her nose into her mother's side. For a moment, everyone froze. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the volunteers let out a collective sigh, shoulders relaxing as the scene unfolded before them, a miracle wrought not by luck, but by patience and kindness. Just as they started to regroup, the ground beneath the outermost plank gave way with a sucking groan. Paul, carrying a coil of rope, toppled sideways, his boot vanishing up to the ankle in the mud. The high schoolers scrambled, grabbing his arms, while Sheriff Brooks barked out orders. "Easy! Don't pull too hard or you'll both go in!" Evan rushed over, heart pounding, helping to anchor Paul as he rocked his trapped foot free. The mud released him with a wet pop, nearly yanking his boot off in the process. Laughter followed, nervous, shaky, but real. Even Juniper looked up, head cocked as if mildly amused. "Guess I'm not as nimble as I used to be," Paul joked, dusting himself off. "Maybe the bobcat should be in charge." The mood lightened, the close call serving as a reminder that the forest could humble anyone, expert or amateur. They redoubled their efforts, moving slower, double-checking every step and knot. Tessa, meanwhile, improvised a sling for Maple, weaving strips of an old towel into a hammock so the kitten could rest next to her mother without slipping into the mud again. The high schoolers brought more branches and pine boughs, layering them to form a soft barrier around the family. Sheriff Brooks, always watchful, moved quietly along the perimeter, radioing updates and making sure no curious hikers wandered too close. Then, as the sun climbed higher, a new problem arose. Clouds rolled in from the west, dark and heavy, promising rain. The first droplets hit the leaves with a cold hiss. Dr. Lively frowned. "We need to hurry. If the pit floods, it'll be even harder to keep them safe." Evan grabbed a spare tarp and, with Paul and the students, fashioned a rough canopy over the little shelter. The rain came harder, the steady drumming adding urgency to every movement. The mud pit began to fill, water seeping in from all sides. Suddenly, Juniper let out a sharp yowl, her ears pinned flat. Maple squeaked, shivering in her makeshift sling. Evan rushed to their side, feeling the mud shift beneath his feet. "Hold on," he said, voice barely audible above the rain. He looped his arms around Juniper and Maple, pressing them close to the dry center of the shelter. Tessa tossed him another blanket, and Dr. Lively checked Maple's pulse. Her hands steady despite the chaos. A gust of wind tore the tarp loose at one corner, sending a sheet of rain cascading into the pit. Sheriff Brooks and Paul scrambled to pin it down, their faces grim. For a moment, it looked as if all their hard work would wash away, but teamwork and sheer stubbornness prevailed. Inch by inch, the group restored their defenses, shoring up the canopy and digging a quick trench to drain water away from the shelter. The worst of the storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the air sharp with the scent of ozone and wet pine. The sun returned, glimmering through the trees. Juniper and Maple huddled together, exhausted but safe, their tiny family cocooned in the heart of the wild. Evan glanced around at the muddy, tired faces of his friends and neighbors. Despite the setbacks, despite the danger, they'd come together, humans and wild creatures alike, to do something extraordinary. For a moment, under the dripping pines, Evan felt the weight of his loneliness lift, replaced by the warmth of connection and the hope that maybe, just maybe, a broken heart could begin to heal. One act of compassion at a time. No sooner had the rain eased than the forest air seemed to thicken with a warning. The clouds had passed, but the damage was done. The red mud pit, once merely treacherous, was now a churning mire, the surface broken by slicks of water and shifting clumps of earth. The shelter that Evan and the team had worked so hard to build trembled at the edges, threatened by every trickle of runoff from the rising slope above. Evan's boots squelched as he checked the perimeter. Every step felt less certain. The boards, once solid, floated a little now, the ends disappearing under the brown flood. "Watch your footing," he called, the words nearly lost in the soggy hush. Paul and Sheriff Brooks moved gingerly along the planks, retying the corners of the tarp and clearing debris, their faces drawn with concern. Tessa clutched Maple, the kitten's body limp but breathing, her small chest heaving under the emergency blanket. Dr. Lively hovered nearby, watching for signs of shock or hypothermia. Juniper, the mother bobcat, paced with renewed agitation, her limping steps now more pronounced. She let out a yowl more urgent than before, a raw sound of panic and frustration. "Evan, the mud's rising!" Tessa shouted, eyes wide. She held up Maple, whose hindquarters were beginning to sink into the mire again, despite the layers of boughs and towels beneath her. "If we wait any longer—" Before Evan could answer, a sudden crack, like a tree branch snapping, shattered the uneasy calm. The edge of the pit, softened by the rain, gave way in a rush, sending a wave of thick red mud sliding toward Maple and Juniper. Paul lunged to block it, but the force was too much. The boards beneath him slipped, and he nearly lost his balance. Evan acted on instinct. "Hold the ropes!" he shouted, grabbing the nearest length and tying it around his waist. "I'm going in!" Sheriff Brooks's eyes flashed. "Wait, it's two!" But Evan was already moving, bracing himself as he plunged into the pit, mud swallowing his boots up to the calves. Every step was a battle, his muscles straining, breath harsh as the mud sucked at his legs, cold and heavy. The stench of wet earth filled his nose. All the while, Maple's cries rose in pitch. First muffled, then, in a heart-stopping instant, cut off altogether. "Maple!" Tessa screamed, her hands flying to her mouth. Evan's blood ran cold. He lunged toward the spot where he'd last seen the kitten, his gloved hands sinking deep into the thick, red soup. For a terrifying second, there was only mud, cold and unyielding. He groped blindly, his heart beating so hard he thought it might split his chest. And then, there, the faintest movement beneath his fingers. Evan dug deeper, grasping hold of Maple's tiny, sodden body. He pulled, the suction fierce, until finally she came free, coughing and gasping, her paws scrabbling at his wrist. He cradled Maple to his chest, wrapping her in his jacket as he stumbled backward. The mud, thick as concrete, tried to hold him. "Rope! Pull!" he yelled, barely able to lift his legs. Paul, Sheriff Brooks, and Tessa hauled on the other end, their combined strength dragging Evan up the slippery incline and out of the pit. He collapsed on solid ground, mud-soaked and trembling, clutching Maple against his heart. Dr. Lively was instantly at his side, checking Maple's breath and pulse. The kitten, slick with muck and nearly limp, let out a weak, rattling mewl. "She's alive," Dr. Lively said, relief sharp in her voice. "But we need to warm her now. Fast!" Tessa wrapped another blanket around Maple, rubbing her gently to encourage circulation. Evan just knelt there, shivering, tears and rainwater streaking down his face. For a second, everything, the forest, the storm, the ache of old wounds, fell away. All that existed was the tiny life trembling in his arms, so close to being lost. Juniper crept forward, her body low and cautious, then nuzzled Maple fiercely. She licked her kitten's face, soft and frantic, letting out a strange, purring yowl that seemed to vibrate through Evan's bones. He reached out, not thinking, and let his muddy hand rest on Juniper's shoulder for the briefest instant, a gesture of solidarity that neither animal nor man could fully explain. Around them, the others breathed out a collective sigh. Paul wiped sweat from his brow. Tessa dabbed at tears, and Sheriff Brooks, unflappable as ever, took a steadying breath before directing people to check the shelter and supplies. The rain had passed, but the danger lingered. The pit was ruined, the mud a threat to anyone who strayed too close. "We'll have to move them," Dr. Lively said quietly. "Maple needs dry ground, and Juniper, she's had enough for one day." Evan nodded, rising slowly. He was soaked, exhausted, and covered in bruises he wouldn't feel until morning, but his spirit was light, buoyed by the simple fact that for once, the wild had let him in. Sheriff Brooks clapped him on the shoulder, her face split by a rare, proud grin. "Not bad for a Monday, Turner." He let out a shaky laugh. "I'd rather wrestle a bear next time." As the team worked to rebuild the shelter on higher ground, the sun slipped through the clouds, illuminating the battered clearing. Juniper and Maple, mother and daughter, huddled together, alive and, against the odds, safe. The mud had nearly claimed them, but teamwork, courage, and a little wild luck had pulled them back from the brink. Evan looked around at the faces, tired, muddy, and shining with relief. In that moment, he knew this was more than just a rescue. It was a reminder. Even in the wild, even in the deepest mud, hope could find a foothold. As the last streaks of rainwater trickled down the trunks of ancient pines, the clearing fell into a hush, wary, reverent, as if every creature was holding its breath. Evan, still slicked with mud and trembling from adrenaline, knelt a respectful distance from the battered little family. Juniper pressed close to Maple, her head bowed, her rough tongue working furiously to clean every patch of mud from her kitten's fur. Each stroke was shaky, desperate, but full of a mother's relentless devotion. Maple shivered in the makeshift nest of blankets and pine boughs, her eyes fluttering as warmth seeped slowly back into her small body. Dr. Lively checked her pulse again, then nodded, relief showing in her tired smile. She's coming around. Good reflexes. She just needs her mom and some time. Evan's heart felt squeezed in his chest, his mind replaying every terrifying second in the mud pit. The moment Maple's cries stopped, the cold panic, the desperate digging, the miracle of feeling life stir beneath his hands. He'd never believed in signs, not really, but this rescue had left him raw, cracked open in places he'd thought long since scarred over. He met Juniper's eyes as she paused, her muzzle muddy, her pupils wide and black. For a moment, neither moved. There was a silent conversation in that gaze, a wild gratitude, a raw plea for trust, a mother's fear and relief all tangled together. Evan nodded once, quietly, not daring to speak. The humans kept their distance, aware this moment was not theirs to interrupt. Sheriff Brooks, who'd seen her share of strange things in alder pines, stood by the tree line, arms crossed over her chest and mouth set in a thin, proud line. Paul and the high schoolers worked quietly, resetting the shelter, shoring up the little drainage trench, whispering to each other as if afraid to break the spell. Tessa hovered, hands on her knees, her face shining with awe. "She knows we saved her baby," she whispered, almost to herself. "You can see it in her eyes." Juniper resumed her gentle, insistent grooming, her big paw holding Maple steady as she worked over the kitten's head and back. Maple whimpered, then let out a tiny, grumpy squeak, almost a protest, almost a thank you. The volunteers smiled, laughter rising and then falling again, soft as the mist that curled along the ground. Evan noticed how his own breathing had slowed, his body relaxing for the first time since dawn. He let the hush settle into his bones, filling the empty spaces grief and loneliness had carved out over months and years. The forest around him seemed transformed, no longer a place of aching solitude, but a cathedral of second chances, where wild and human hearts could meet for a moment in understanding. Dr. Lively joined Evan, her eyes gentle but probing. "You did good, Turner. I've patched up a lot of critters, but I've never seen a wild mother trust people like this, not unless they have no other hope." Evan shrugged, voice rough. "Guess she could tell we weren't here to hurt her." "That's not all of it." Dr. Lively paused, watching Juniper nuzzle Maple's belly. "Some animals know when to ask for help. Most people don't. Maybe you could teach the folks around here a thing or two." He let out a weak chuckle, wiping his hands on the grass. "I'm not much for speeches. You don't have to be. You just have to show up." She squeezed his shoulder and moved back to her bag, making notes, her presence quietly reassuring. As Maple's shivering eased and her breaths came steadier, Juniper curled around her, forming a protective crescent. The mother bobcat's body blocked the wind, her warmth cradling her kitten in a living shelter. The others watched, spellbound, as the raw bond between mother and child mended itself before their eyes. Paul, ever the storyteller, muttered, "That's the wild for you. Teaches you about love the hard way." Sheriff Brooks smirked. "Teaches you about teamwork, too. Nobody saves the day out here on their own." The sky brightened, soft shafts of sunlight filtering down through the pine needles, glinting off water droplets and turning the battered clearing into a mosaic of gold and green. A few birds began to sing again, tentative at first, then bolder, as if signaling to all that the danger had passed. The world, for just a moment, seemed to celebrate the victory with them. Evan took a slow walk around the shelter, making sure every plank and branch held firm. His limbs ached, but the pain felt clean, earned, a physical echo of the hope rising in his chest. He thought of his father, of Claire, of all the mornings he'd spent alone and angry, and realized he'd been searching for this feeling longer than he knew. Not the thrill of heroism, but the quiet certainty that his presence mattered. He sat nearby, close enough for Juniper to see, but not so close as to threaten her fragile peace. He didn't try to capture the moment on his phone. He just let it live, as wild things should. Time passed in gentle waves. Dr. Lively wrote her notes. The high schoolers fetched more supplies. Tessa cleaned up the muddy towels. Paul recounted the rescue under his breath to one of the younger volunteers, adding a little extra drama for effect. Sheriff Brooks handled the radio, updating dispatch and assuring the town that the emergency was under control. But everyone's attention kept drifting back to Juniper and Maple, to the miracle of their survival, the way hope clung to them like dew. As the afternoon lengthened, Maple lifted her head, blinking up at her mother. Juniper licked her nose and then, with a kind of solemn dignity, looked directly at Evan. Their eyes met, human and wild, wounded and healing, alone and not alone. "Thank you." The words weren't spoken, but Evan heard them all the same. He smiled, tears hot and silent on his cheeks, and whispered, "You're welcome. Stay safe, little family." In that luminous hush, where trust was the rarest currency and kindness the only rule, Evan Turner understood that some bonds, however brief, however fragile, could last a lifetime. Sunlight shimmered through the towering pines, drying puddles of rainwater and making the battered clearing gleam. The world had shifted in the last few hours. Something about the stillness after the storm, the hush that followed the wild cries, felt sacred. For a long moment, no one dared disturb Juniper and Maple as they huddled together in their little nest, a portrait of survival and love that seemed both ancient and utterly new. Sheriff Brooks broke the spell, her boots squishing softly as she stepped forward, phone in hand. "Hold up, don't move just yet," she called, voice gentle. "Let's remember this." Evan, still sitting cross-legged in the mud, managed a tired smile. Tessa brushed her hair back and crouched beside him, her hands resting lightly on the blanket-wrapped Maple. Paul and the high schoolers squeezed in, arms around each other's shoulders, all grins and muddy knees. Dr. Lively gave a rare thumbs up. Even Juniper, though wild, seemed to sense the moment's gravity. She lifted her head, yellow eyes gleaming as Maple pressed close, still shivering but no longer afraid. Brooks angled her phone, catching them all in the frame. The muddy ranger, the volunteers, the battered shelter, the wild mother and her kitten, even the ruined mud pit in the background. The click of the shutter was soft, but final. In that photo, the impossible became real. Human and animal, danger and hope, all captured in a single heartbeat. Later, as the group packed up their supplies and prepared to leave the clearing to its rightful owners, Tessa texted the photo to the local newspaper, her message simple but urgent. "You won't believe what happened in the pines today." Word spread like wildfire. By late afternoon, the picture had made its way onto the community bulletin board, the town's Facebook page, and every group chat from the school teachers to the hunting club. The caption was short and sweet. "A miracle in alder pines." Phones buzzed, doors opened, and neighbors stopped each other in the grocery store, marveling at the rescue. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others wiped away tears. The photo was more than proof of a daring rescue. It was a window into the soul of the town, a story of compassion that belonged to everyone now. At the ranger station, Evan cleaned up as best he could, scrubbing mud from his arms and hands, the water running red down the drain. He found himself staring at the photo Sheriff Brooks had printed and pinned above the front desk. In it, he looked both older and lighter than he remembered, like a man who'd just set down a burden he'd carried too long. Visitors trickled in, drawn by the story. A teacher from the elementary school brought her class to see the spot in the woods where the miracle happened. The local pastor mentioned the Bobcat rescue in Sunday's sermon, calling it a reminder that even in the wildest corners, grace can find us. The bakery on Main Street offered free muffins to anyone who showed the photo at the counter, and someone even drew a cartoon of Maple and Juniper, taping it to the town's big bulletin board. Sheriff Brooks, for her part, seemed both proud and faintly amused by all the attention. "Folk around here needed some good news," she told Evan, sipping coffee from a thermos on his porch. "Guess you started something bigger than you thought?" Evan shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "Wasn't just me. Took the whole town, and a very brave bobcat." He watched the photo go viral in their small way, spreading from alder pines to neighboring towns, then popping up on regional wildlife pages. Each time someone shared it, the caption grew, "A wild mother trusted us. When compassion bridges worlds. Proof that kindness matters." The photo did more than tell a story. It planted seeds. A few days later, the town council announced plans for a wildlife watch day, an afternoon for families to walk the woods with guides, learning how to spot, respect, and help local animals in need. Dr. Lively agreed to give a talk about living with Montana's wild creatures. Even Sheriff Brooks promised to dust off her old binoculars and lead a hike for the kindergartners. For Evan, something in his life shifted. The quiet ache that had haunted him, grief, loneliness, regret, began to fade, replaced by a sense of belonging he hadn't known since childhood. He fielded calls from people wanting to help, offering old towels, wood for new shelters, even donations for the Wildlife Rescue Fund. He took a deep breath, the mountain air cool and sweet, and felt, for the first time in ages, the certainty that he was right where he belonged. Late one evening, as the sun slid behind the pines and the woods filled with twilight shadows, Evan sat on his porch, staring at the photo on his phone. He zoomed in on Juniper's eyes, the same wild gaze that had pleaded with him on the muddy road, that had trusted him with her world's most precious thing. He realized he wasn't just looking at a story about animals. He was looking at proof of connection between people and the wild, between neighbors, between strangers drawn together by the simple, stubborn refusal to give up on hope. Sometimes, a miracle doesn't change the world all at once. Sometimes it just reminds you the world is worth saving. One small life, one wild chance, one act of trust at a time. And as darkness gathered in the pines, Evan whispered into the night, "Thank you, Juniper, for trusting me, for reminding us all." He listened to the quiet, no sirens, no voices, just the ancient song of the forest, and knew that the story wasn't over. It had only just begun to grow. The story of the wild bobcat and her kitten spread through alder pines like spring wildfire, sparking conversations in diners, schools, and living rooms for weeks to come. Every time Evan passed the bulletin board in town, he saw new notes, children's drawings of bobcats and pine trees, little thank you cards, and clippings of the now famous photograph taped beside the police reports and lost dog flyers. But it wasn't just the story that lingered. It was the feeling. In a town where folks often kept to themselves, a sense of togetherness bloomed, quiet but powerful, like wildflowers in the understory. On the first sunny Saturday after the rescue, Evan found himself standing at the trailhead, nerves prickling as people gathered for the inaugural Wildlife Watch Day. He wasn't a natural public speaker, and the idea of sharing his story made his palms sweat. Yet as the kids and their parents arrived, boots muddy, binoculars dangling, voices bright with excitement, he realized he was no longer standing alone. Tessa was there with her wildlife club students. Paul wore his best flannel and led the way with a walking stick. And even Sheriff Brooks, who preferred the quiet of the trees, joined them, handing out safety whistles and trail maps. Evan cleared his throat, the crowd falling silent. He held up a laminated print of the photograph, Juniper, Maple, and the muddy, smiling rescue team. "Some of you were there that day," he began, voice steadying with each word. "But all of you were part of it. It wasn't just one person or even one group. It was a whole town coming together, answering a call for help, no matter who or what was asking." He glanced at the kids, who looked back at him wide-eyed. "Sometimes," he said, "the bravest thing in the wild isn't running or fighting. Sometimes it's trusting. Juniper trusted us, and I hope if you ever get the chance, you'll be the kind of person a wild animal can trust too." The parents smiled. A few teachers dabbed their eyes. Even Sheriff Brooks looked away, pretending to study her map a little too closely. The day unfolded in gentle adventure. Dr. Lively led a workshop on reading animal tracks, her hands dusted with chalk and dirt. The high schoolers set up a table of found feathers, shed antlers, and casts of paw prints. Tessa guided a group of kids through a quiet patch of pines, teaching them how to listen for the faint rustle of deer or the call of a distant hawk. Evan found himself fielding questions from curious children and cautious adults alike. How do you know if an animal needs help? What's the safest way to approach? Did you ever think about giving up? He answered every question honestly, sometimes with a story from his own life, sometimes simply by admitting he was learning too. As the group picnicked in a sun-dappled clearing, Evan looked around and felt a quiet pride blooming inside him. This, community, connection, shared wonder, was what his father had loved about the ranger's life. It was what Evan had been missing, even before grief and loss had shut him away from the world. That afternoon, the children made posters for the local school, each one decorated with bobcats and pine trees, hearts and hopeful messages. Be kind to animals. Trust is wild. Help when you can. When Evan stepped into the school library the next week, the walls were covered with their drawings, a patchwork of hope and memory. But the story didn't stop at the edge of town. People from neighboring counties reached out, asking for advice on building wildlife-friendly spaces or how to organize their own rescue teams. Donations trickled in for the animal shelter, and volunteers signed up for the next trail cleanup. Dr. Lively started a monthly wildlife clinic at the rec center, and Tessa's club doubled in size. And every so often, as the weeks rolled on, there were new sightings, always quiet, always at a distance. A flash of tawny fur at the edge of the meadow, two shadows darting through the pines at sunset. The rumor was always the same: Juniper and Maple, wild and free, watching from the shadows, as if reminding everyone that miracles were possible if only you cared enough to look. One dusky evening, Evan found himself back at the old forest road. He parked his truck, rolled down the windows, and listened to the hush, the gentle breeze, the distant cry of an owl. For the first time in years, he felt at home in the silence, not haunted but held. A twig snapped behind him, and for a moment, he glimpsed movement in the trees, a small shape, agile and swift, followed by a larger, limping form. Juniper and Maple, together, paused at the edge of the undergrowth. Juniper looked back, her eyes catching the last gold rays of the setting sun, and Evan felt the old connection spark again. Gratitude, recognition, a wordless goodbye. He didn't reach for his camera. He didn't call out. He simply watched as they slipped away, their forms melting into the forest's embrace. The wild, Evan realized, doesn't need to be tamed to be understood. It needs to be respected, cherished, and sometimes trusted to teach us more about our own hearts than we ever thought possible. As night fell, the lights of alder pines twinkled in the distance, a town changed by a single act of trust, united by a story that would echo long after the last paw print faded from the mud. And somewhere deep in the woods, a mother and her child thrived, a living testament to the bonds that last, between wild and human, between hope and memory, between the hearts that dare to believe. Morning sunlight spilled through the pine canopy, golden and gentle, as if the forest itself was offering a blessing. Evan stood quietly at the edge of a familiar clearing, his boots dusted with dew, the air alive with the chorus of waking birds. The wilds beyond alder pines had always been a place of mystery and solitude, a world that seemed to belong to another time. Now, after everything, it felt like home. He watched a squirrel dart up a trunk, pausing to chatter at a blue jay perched above. The memory of Juniper's desperate kneeling, Maple's tiny cry in the mud, and the crowd of friends and strangers working together still pulsed in Evan's mind. Sometimes, when the morning was this still, he half expected to hear that wild mother's yowl echo through the trees, a reminder that trust can take the shape of fur and claws and a single, pleading gaze. Evan took a slow breath, letting it fill his lungs and settle his nerves. He'd been asked to speak at the school that morning, to share the story with the kids who'd drawn bobcats on every hallway wall, who now looked for wild tracks wherever they walked. It made him nervous, but it also filled him with a warmth that reached the coldest corners of his heart. Maybe, just maybe, the story was bigger than him, bigger than the little town even. As he reached the school's front steps, Sheriff Brooks waved him over, a rare smile breaking her usual stern expression. "You ready, Turner? They've been talking about this all week." Evan chuckled, tugging at the collar of his shirt. "I think I'm more scared than when I was in that mud pit." She laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "You'll do fine. Just speak from the heart." Inside the gymnasium, sunlight filtered through high windows, illuminating the sea of eager faces. Teachers lined the back wall, some with their phones out, while the youngest kids sat cross-legged on the floor, their eyes wide with anticipation. Evan cleared his throat, the memory of the pines settling around him like a cloak. "A few weeks ago, something happened out in our woods, something I'll never forget." He told the story, how the wild bobcat had knelt in the road at dawn, how a kitten's cry changed a routine patrol into a rescue, how neighbors from every part of town braved the storm and the mud, how a mother's love could shatter the wall between wild and human. He didn't embellish or rush. He let the pauses linger, let the children's eyes travel with him through the pines, Let them feel the hush when hope nearly vanished and the surge when teamwork brought it back. When he finished, a quiet fell over the room. It was a silence filled with awe, the kind that only a true story, lived and shared, can bring. Then hands shot up, questions tumbling out. Were you scared, Mr. Turner? How did Juniper know to trust you? Do you think Maple remembers you? Evan smiled. I was scared, but I think Juniper and Maple were too. And maybe that's the point. Sometimes the bravest thing is to trust, even when you're afraid, even when you're wild. A little girl in the front row raised her hand. What's the lesson, Mr. Turner? He paused, then let the words come from someplace deeper than memory, a place born of muddy boots and trembling hands, of a mother's yowl and a child's mule. For me, the lesson is that every creature, wild or tame, has a story worth saving. Sometimes what matters most isn't what we do alone, but what we do together. If you ever see someone or something that needs help, I hope you remember Juniper. I hope you choose to be kind, because you never know how much difference that kindness can make. A teacher nodded, blinking back tears. Kids clapped. Even the principal, usually stoic, stood a little straighter. As he left the school, a parade of small hands pressed drawings and thank you cards into Evan's palms. Scenes of bobcats in the woods, of a man with a muddy jacket smiling at a wild family. He promised to pin them up at the ranger station, a patchwork of hope and memory for all to see. The days that followed slipped into a new rhythm. Evan spent more time in the forest, leading hikes, checking on the new wildlife shelters, training volunteers who'd once thought the woods were too wild to matter. The town felt different, more alive. Strangers greeted each other on the street, children boasted of new animal tracks discovered near the creek, and at every community event, someone inevitably mentioned the Bobcat story. Yet life, as it always does, moved forward. The forest grew thick with spring. The old mud pit faded beneath wildflowers and new grass. Some days, when the sky was just the right shade of gold, Evan would drive the old forest road at dawn, eyes scanning the edge of the woods. He knew better than to expect another miracle, but still, he looked. One morning, as the sun broke over the pines, he spotted movement at the tree line. Two shapes, one larger, limping, the other small and fleet, emerged for just a moment before melting back into shadow. Juniper and Maple, wild and free, forever changed by a single moment of trust. Evan smiled, his heart full. He reached for his radio but paused. There was nothing to report. No emergency, no crisis. Just the knowledge that he'd been part of something lasting, something wild and true. He thought of all the listeners who might one day hear the story, on YouTube, in classrooms, around campfires, and wanted to leave them with a final message. So he spoke, softly, the words meant for anyone who still believed in hope. For me, that moment, when a wild mother knelt in the mud and trusted us, reminds me that every creature has a story worth saving. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope, or leave your own story of wild kindness below. Support your local wildlife heroes, or just pause next time you meet a creature in need. Sometimes, the bravest thing in the wild is to trust. He watched as the morning sun climbed above the trees, casting long shadows through the pines. The woods, once a place of sorrow, now felt like a promise, proof that the wild and the human can meet, not in fear, but in compassion. And as Juniper and Maple vanished into the forest's heart, Evan Turner knew that he too had finally come home.